I'm going to talk to you about some principles for good multimodal storytelling. And there is a PowerPoint that I have shared with you both in your syllabus and online in our course shell in Moodle. And so please feel free to reference that, but you'll also see those slides appear here in the video with me. But the first thing I want to talk about is the kind of three parts, which really are four, that I think are part of every story. And so first is kind of the beginning of the story, but I've named it character and context, or the character who's in the story and the world that they live in. I think that if you find a way to communicate to your audience, and you've already been working on this, the specialness of your character and the sort of uniqueness of the world that they live in, then you're already well on your way to really capturing the hearts and minds of your audience. And when I say the uniqueness of the world they live in, there's actually got to be two elements to any world in any story that you encounter that will draw you in as an audience member. And that is that the story is, the world is relatable. There are elements of it that correlate with our own experiences, but it also has to be fabulous. In other words, like something different, something other, something that's outside of our experience. So even when we're talking about a historical world, we shape that world in such a way that makes it really particular to the events or the person or the time that we are telling a story about. So think hard about your character and your context, because both of those have to be set up in the first act of your story. However, I am going to now, throughout the rest of this little lecture, reference some of the stories that I have also linked for you, because they treat this idea of world a little bit differently, and they also treat their character development a little bit differently. So the three stories that I'm asking you to pay attention to are Ironing by Ryan Trauman. I think I showed that to you in class earlier. It's a story that's composed mostly of still photographs, very chill REM song. REM is a band from the 80s, but I know that was a long time ago. And then his narration, his sort of carefully composed narration, that on the first glance, that's what the story is composed of formally. When we talk about what the world of the story is, though, clearly this is a world of memory, and specifically a memory that's rooted in like the 1970s Midwest, a very kind of domestic story world. It takes place in the split level that Ryan Trauman lives with his brothers and sisters. And right now, I'm talking about the stories if you've watched it already. If you haven't, you should pause this video and watch that video. And then go ahead and watch the McCartney video, also George McCartney's video, Change Through the Face of God, and also listen to Alyssa Crowley's podcast episode called The Joshua Treatise. All three of those things are things I'm going to be referencing throughout the rest of this lecture. All right, so the context for the story does get fleshed out throughout that story in the ironing story, but it also gets fleshed out at the beginning. You have a real clear sense of where this world is going to be taking place at the beginning. Similarly, George's story starts with a broadcast by Ronald Reagan. So in a sense, we know that this story is a story about a world that has to do with a nation and a national identity and a crisis. But then the next vision we see is a much more familiar one. It's George's father sitting in a chair in his home. It's a kind of familiar looking home, kind of a Midwestern middle class home, and George's father's dress. All these things kind of indicate to us what kind of world this is. But then George starts to tell a story too about where this story happened for him. And that's not a story that we actually see. We don't actually see him in teacher college being prepared. He evokes those images for us. And that's an important thing to recognize about multimodal storytelling. In fact, I haven't defined multimodal storytelling for you yet in this lecture, but multimodal essentially suggests that you're telling the story using multiple layers of communication together in concert with one another. So in a book, the single layer, it's a single mode kind of communication, is actually, it's the words that you read in sequence. Now, once you get into a comic book, it's a little bit different because there are pictures and words. It's kind of multimodal, but it still feels a little bit more like a single mode text. When you're watching a movie, clearly it's multimodal. There are both pictures and there's audio, and often there are other elements also, like a sound scape that is playing in the background. Oftentimes there's a soundtrack, music that's being used. And even in podcasts, there's definitely a multimodal component, because it's never just one person talking all by themselves, but it's a combination of several layers, a multi-track way of recording the story, so that there are some different elements that we'll talk about later on. Okay, so that's character and context. In Alyssa's story, this story takes place during a conversation between Alyssa and her dad in the car. And that's one of the worlds of the story. It's also a story that definitely takes place in her father's kind of growing up years. Her father's like college aged in this story, and he's just arrived at college. And there's a continuity then, right? Because our audience for this story is college age students. Alyssa, we know that she is a college age student when she made it. So the world of college kind of hovers in the story. However, Alyssa's choice in this story is to clearly show us the context or the world of a father-daughter conversation in a car. That's the world that we open on in the first act of the story. Later, she really sort of unfolds, or allows her father's voice to unfold the context of college. And that's actually a fine choice, to sort of recognize that there are different times to reveal information that work kind of intuitively for your particular story. So as you're trying to think about where everything fits, remember, these chunks have to be moved around. That's the process of storytelling that you're doing as a storyteller. So the second principle of storytelling is the idea of conflict or clash. And the conflict or clash in storytelling is one of the most important things about a story. If your story lacks conflict or clash, then your audience lacks interest. And unfortunately, this is one of the hardest things about this particular assignment, because people are not sort of likely to talk about a real, genuine emotional conflict when they're telling you the story about this media text. It's just a story about a media text they like, right? There is some conflict lurking in the background. Maybe the conflict is a conflict between the person and the world they inhabit. Maybe the conflict is between an old self and a new self. Maybe the conflict is between like a sense of loss and grief versus a sense of stability and clarity. And if you've watched those stories and listened to those stories, you know that I just referenced all three of the stories that we have. So finding out what your conflict is, hinting at it early, and then really trying to develop the presence, the lurking presence of that conflict. What is the clash between two forces that makes us want to keep watching? Every story that you love is just ripe with this kind of conflict. It's one of the things that you need to think about. So the third part is the completion. And the completion of the story is just kind of the satisfaction in the third act. In high school English class, maybe you learned it as the denouement, the falling action. It's the resolution of the story. But there are so many different kinds of resolution that really can work in a nice way. So for instance, the resolution for George's father has very much to do with his own resolve. So the story starts on this national scale, but it ends with a sense of who he will be as a teacher and how he is inspired by Krista McAuliffe's journey and the way that the nation kind of came together. In Ryan Traumann's conclusion or resolution, he has this sort of sense of connection to his mother. And so like it's really a sense of connection that transcends the sense of clash, and the clash is obviously loss in this case. And for Alyssa, I think that Alyssa does a really surprising thing when she reveals to us in the third act, in the narrator's voice that often punctuates the car ride, that for her, hearing these stories about U2, which is an album that her father introduced her to, so it's music that she's grown up kind of loving in a nostalgic way, now adds a whole other layer of meaning because she feels really connected to him, who is the same age as she is now, and this music is this kind of strange connection, not only between what happened in the past to him and what is happening in the present to her, but also a connection between the two of them as a father and daughter, which, as you know, in this story is especially important because the main clash of this story is the discontinuity or the sense of loss and escape and change that her father goes through because of a broken relationship with his father. So the resolution kind of happens within the narrator's voice, which is fine, but it sort of reverberates through all these other elements. And the insight there, obviously, for how a media text affects us is that it has this power to affect us relationally, right? Like movies, games, TV shows have this power to bond us together with friends and family that's very powerful. And when it's articulated in a particular way for particular people, it becomes more powerful, more compelling, more beautiful, and it sort of reveals some truths about the human condition that we didn't know before.